Shall we begin? Sure. All right. Welcome to the Elmendorf. I'm Claudine Close, President of Historic Red Hook. We are very honored to have a great speaker here today on the topic of World War I. As some of you know, Dutchess County Office of the Historian's focus this year is on the Year of the Veteran, and particularly World War I. So we're honored actually to have the Dutchess County historian here, Will Tatum, as well as the president of the Dutchess County Historical Society.
Oh.
But most of all, we are honored to have a speaker who I'm going to let one of our board members introduce because she brought her to us. So before she does that, I just want to say if anybody knows people who are not members yet of Historic Red Hook, please encourage them to take one of these and pass them around. That way you will be in the know. And afterwards, I hope you'll join us in the tap room for refreshments. So I think that's it. I'm going to let Beth Jones introduce Connie Potter.
So my dear friend and compadre, Connie Potter, is retired now from the National Archives in Washington, and she came up this weekend for a special event that we were having. And we convinced her, after much prodding for several years, to stay and do a program for us. So Connie is, I said retired, so she retired on April Fool's Day 2014, on my recommendation. She's a bit of a character. So she worked for 30 years in reference, specializing in federal records of interest to genealogists. She did extensive research on World War I graves registration services and the Gold Star Mother Pilgrimage for the mothers and widows of deceased World War I soldiers and sailors buried overseas and at sea. Since retiring, she contributes to the World War I Centennial Commission documenting Doughboys website. During her career at the National Archives, she spoke regularly at national and local genealogy conferences on such topics at the federal population and non-population censuses, how weather affects family history, federal records relating to Laura Ingalls Wilder, and how to do genealogical research at the National Archives. She's a much sought-after speaker. While she is retired for several years, they just can't let her go. She writes ongoing articles for their newsletter, as well as they send her around the country from time to time to speak on different things that she's an expert in. She's been interviewed by both local and national radio and television after the opening of the 1920, 1930, and 1940 federal censuses. She lives in Arlington, Virginia, with her cat, Alice Roosevelt Longworth, or Allie, as the mere mortals call her. And she's a pretty funny lady, and we just love having her in our life, and she's here to entertain us today with some good information. Connie Potter.
Well, I want to thank Beth for inviting me, and also Susan for the songs that you heard when you came in. And there's one that's going to be, in fact, be part of the lecture. The only thing I need is
Just turn on the laptop. I think it just, yeah, goes to sleep. There you go.
There it is.
Yeah.
one of the things I want to make clear before I start that most of the records I'm talking about today are not online.
Is there such a thing?
Yes, which leads me to my favorite mantra, and if you leave with nothing else but this in mind, remember, it's called research. Not data retrieval. Yes. I'm always amazed when these things work. The United States declared war on April 16, 1917, but the first troops didn't get over until June 25th. And this is amazing when you consider that we had a standing army of between 133,000 and 200,000 with no heavy artillery in 1917. And there were 800,000 men in the National Guard. By the end of the war, 4 million men were in the Army and 2 million had been sent overseas. And the AEF, American Expeditionary Forces, comprised the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps. Okay. The AEF are the American Expeditionary Forces with an S. You can remember it has S because United States has states. States starts with an S, ends with an S. The BEF, or British Expeditionary Force, England is the E, E on the end of force.
Good.
Got it.
Yeah, I hope so. That's important.
It's
Very
very
important.
They talk funny over there anyway. Singularly, I mean.
I may just take you all home with me. Okay, one of the reasons I did this lecture is in 1973, you may be aware, there was a major fire in St. Louis, Missouri, that destroyed the Army records from 1912 to 1963. Well, that pretty well takes care of World War I and World War II. It does not include the Coast Guard, Marine Corps, or Navy, though I give a bit of information on Marine Corps and Navy, because the more information you have, the easier it is to search the records. The service records are available, that are available, oh, that was redundant, at the National Archives 62 years after the date the person leaves the military. So, moving really too fast. July 16th, 1956, if you served before, on that date or before, your records are available. One of the things that's important in these records is there are no service numbers for the officers, only for the enlisted men. There was a transition in records keeping, and as some of you know, that's really exciting for archivists. It is. And as of February 1918, as I said, it was for enlisted men only. If an enlisted man enlisted before then, and for example went on the punitive expedition to Mexico against Pancho Villa, he will not have a service number. I'm going to go through some introductory things and then we're going to get to the people. The regular Army comprised the 1st through 8th divisions, and that included the 5th and 6th Marines in the 2nd Division. The National Guard units were the 26th through the 42nd Divisions, and where did I put it? The 6th New York National Guard Division became the 27th. The 69th became the 165th, part of the Rainbow Division. And the 15th New York National Guard Division became the 369th for the Harlem Hellfires. The National Army or draftees were the 76th through the 93rd, and the 92nd and the 93rd were for black divisions. Now you'll notice here, it goes 8th through the 26th, and here 42nd through the 76th. One of the stories I've heard is that they left those numbers open, so they were hoping the Germans would think, oh, we're going to fill those with people. They weren't going to, but. Draft registration. On June 5th, 1917, it required all men between 21 and 35 to register, and in all 24 million men registered for the draft. These are on Ancestry, and they show only that the person registered for the draft. It ends there. If the bottom left-hand corner of the card is torn off, that means they're African American. Now, Native Americans all had to enroll in the draft, but those who were U.S. citizens were the only ones liable for the draft. Not all American Indians were U.S. citizens until 1924. And this gets very complicated, and we're going to end it here. This is Newton Baker. We'll come back to him later. This is one of my favorite federal agencies, the American Battle Monuments Commission. And they run the overseas cemeteries for men who are buried overseas, obviously. I'm going to talk a lot about this man and his widow. This is Lewis A. Hawley, a private in the U.S. Army. You'll see he's in the 542nd Engineer Regiment. That was a black engineer battalion. He came from West Virginia, died October 4th, 1918, and that date we'll talk more about later, and he's buried in the Waltham American Cemetery. So when you search for these things online, one of the men I looked for was Victor Chapman of the Lafayette Escadrille. I keep wanting to say Escadrille. So on the web page that I copied, it said V.E. Chapman. However, when I search for it, you can't do Victor because it's not in his Victor, it's V.E. But you have to do V. Chapman because E is put down in his middle initial. The point of this being sometimes just go to the last name, the state in which they live, and keep searching. It also says he is a sergeant in the U.S. Army and his unit is the Lafayette Escadrille. But he's not a U.S. fighter. He's with a French unit. He was in the French Foreign Legion and then later joined the Lafayette Escadrille where he died. I think because he was so well known, and I'm just guessing at this, and he's buried in an American cemetery in France that they put this on the point being you sometimes have to question everything that you see. Grace registration and Gold Star Mother's Pilgrimage are in the records of the Quartermaster General. And the Grace registration started really during, not quite the Civil War. They would bury officers and they tried to bury the men. But as someone in my office so delicately put it, when someone was looking for a Rev War burial site, they dug a hole, they put them in, and they walked away. But starting with the Spanish-American War, they really tried to track the graves, and in World War I, it became something they very much tried to do. And on August 7th, the War Department established the Office of Graves Registration. So what would happen is a man would die. Frequently, they didn't always have the name tags, but they'd bury him with some form of identity, just there within 24 hours, if they could. Then they would come back later, and let's say he died right out here, so they'd bury him here. Then they might put him all in a cemetery in Red Hook. And then later on, put him in a national cemetery, so you could be reburied two or three times. Of course, the problem with the shells and the mud is sometimes people simply blew apart or disappeared. So there's not a record of every man and every burial. I'm going to talk first about the card registers of burials of deceased American soldiers. These are with the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, and I have a handout that shows you how to do this. And here are some of the cards. This is for Lois Hawley, and he has a service number. No, this is for Mr. Holcomb, Frank Holcomb. He was killed in action, 1918. And this is where these cards become important. You see, especially if you're doing family history, you see he's reinterred twice. Here's the name of his mother in Centerville, South Dakota. Here it mentions photographs. We have no idea what the photographs were of or where they may be. These records do not have photographs. Okay. Here's the back. In May 1921, his body was disinterred. He arrived at Antwerp. On the Wheaton was sent to Hoboken. And the ship date, well, here he's, it's 8/21. Mrs. Holcomb, but he arrived a year before he was shipped. So, obviously, again, mistakes can happen on the records, but the preponderance of evidence is that it was 1921. Here's Lewis Hawley. He died of bronchial pneumonia, October 1918. The influenza. He was from Martinsburg, West Virginia, and the research I've done says that Martinsburg had the influenza epidemic in September of 1918. He could have received it from one of the forts that he went to. on the ship. Who knows? But he did die of it. What's interesting about the influenza epidemic is that Wilson did not let people talk about it. It was bad for morale. Now, I'm sorry, if I'm living in Red Hook and all but 6 of you have died, I'm going to notice something. That's the way it was. So, here he's the first burial, the second burial. Here's his wife, Katherine B. Hawley, and we'll get to this later. She sailed August 16th, 1930 on the American Merchant. She went on the pilgrimage. And then on the second one, there's nothing. They didn't remove him to the United States, but here it shows that he's in Lausanne American Cemetery. Corporal Charles, I think you pronounce it Brizzy, he was from here. He died of pneumonia on September 26, 1918, at a base hospital. His body was shipped to Barrett Brothers Undertakers in Barrytown. And his mother was Mrs. Lavinia Brizzy of Red Hook. But she chose not to go on the pilgrimage. But here's one. Harry Reinders, I think you pronounce it Reinders. He died in the Battle of Verdun in October 1918. He was buried at the Argonne American Cemetery. And then in November 1922, he was buried in the Meuse-Argonne Cemetery. But what's interesting, under emergency contact, it has T.W. Lee, friend, Thompson Street, Red Hook. Remarks, mother's address, Mrs. Carrie Smith, Sharon Valley, Connecticut. She's his mother. She's eligible to go on the Gold Star pilgrimage. She doesn't go. And I figure there's a story there. I don't know what it is. Race registration. These records are in St. Louis, Missouri. Unfortunately, they moved them. So here's the report of disinterment and reburial for Lewis Hawley. Again, you get his serial number, his unit, where he was buried first time, where he was buried the second time. He was found in a wooden box and a blanket, badly decomposed, features unrecognizable. There's a reburial body found in the box. Here it says V, but it's A. And I think the best part of this job, they did dental recognition. And frequently the black troops did this job. They just disinterred the body, and then they'd have to look in the mouth and look at, all of this. But there are obviously no wounds or missing parts because he wasn't wounded. His hair was apparently light brown, medium head, apparently straight. The Gold Star Mothers have been obviously in the press a lot lately, but they were established during or after World War I. And a lot of very wealthy women went overseas to see their sons or husbands' graves, usually their sons. And they realized poor women couldn't go over. They would need some support. So they had hearings before Congress, and Congress granted money for pilgrimages between 1930 and 1931. Originally it was just for mothers. And they said, well, a widow might feel sad, so we'll let the widows go. But the fathers couldn't go. There was this theory that a father did not have that feeling with his child that a mother would. So the men didn't get to go. One of the records we found were passports. These women got special passports. Unfortunately, the only ones that I think have been given to the National Archives are passports for aliens. So some of these women or their sons were not U.S. citizens. And in there I found a woman who was born in Tennessee. She's not a U.S. citizen. she married an Austrian, and at that time, if a woman married a person not of American citizenship, whether she ever left the United States or not, she got his citizenship. So she was not an American citizen and had to get an alien passport. This is Catherine Bell Hawley, and I have been researching her for years. She was born in Berkeley County, West Virginia, July 31st, 1893. She married Lewis Hawley sometime in 1918 in Berkeley County, and their daughter Louise was born April 6, 1919, just 6 months after her father died. Catherine was a school teacher in Hedgesville. She died in 1953 and never remarried. I understand she's buried in the cemetery and in Hedgesville. I got on my stomach and crawled over the black part of the cemetery. I haven't found her yet, but I will. She was the only woman, white or black, to go on the pilgrimage from the Eastern Panhandle. And as with many case files, you don't know what you're going to find in the records, but here's some of the things I found for Catherine. She wrote this letter to the Marine Corps and wanted to know if her daughter could come. Her daughter could go, but she'd have to pay for it. And she's the widow of Lewis Hawley. He made his daughter, Louise Elizabeth Hawley, age 10, the date of birth, accompany me, how much would the passport cost. The mother of Lewis Hawley died May 12th, 1919. I have not remarried since. So for genealogists, this is an incredible amount of information. Okay, so here, this is the view she would have seen leaving Hedgesville, West Virginia. And she's heading off to Paris. And they very, very carefully organized the program. And on August 26th, August 26th, a morning devoted to transactions of a personal business. Get your money, get your laundry, you're free. They're going to go to Fontainebleau. And then eventually they get to the cemetery. They give them all a bouquet of flowers that they can lay on the grave. They knew that this would be very, very difficult. One of the decisions they made, though, is they segregated the black women from the white women. And we'll see one of the things here in a second. Now, this is one of my favorite pictures. This is, I'm going to point out some people. This is Benjamin O. Davis, who, when I first saw the record, it said officer who was on the ship that she was on. It said B.O. Davis, and I'm, oh my God. This is Captain Ellis. And I ended up really liking him. He had to enforce the segregation, but he seemed to do it with some sensitivity. But here's my real hero, Noble Sissel.
Wow.
Yeah. He fought in the 369th, and he was best friends with James Reach Europe, the band leader. In fact, they had band engagements throughout France during the war. And one of the songs you heard, but you may not have recognized it, was On Patrol in No Man's Land. And it's not only, it's a great poem. His description of going on patrol in no man's land is brilliant. Sissel with Hubie Blake wrote I'm Just Well About Harry. So I don't know if he met all, but he met all of the black groups leading this band at Les Invalides in Paris. Okay. This restaurant is still along the Champs-Élysées, and every group had lunch there. The reason I love this picture, there's Jack Lemmon from Some Like It Hot. The Marine Corps. The Marine Corps muster rolls on Ancestry. And they give the name, the rank, enlistment date, muster date, and the station where they mustered in. However, these are not enlistment records, so you're not going to get age, date of birth, physical description, next of kin, and they rarely include what's called a case number or a service number. They are 1893 to 1958, and here's what they look like. And you can see they go by officer, here are the trumpeters, and then privates. But here's Opa Mae Johnson. Newton Baker was not really eager to have women in the military, but Josephus Daniels was very eager to have women join both the Navy and the Marine Corps. He said, we're sending these men overseas, we've got to have somebody do the work here in the States, do the paperwork with the quartermaster. So he got women involved right away. And Opa M. Johnson, see, she first mustered in August 1918. Her enlistment date is August 13th. She's a private. And then you just see her service listed through here. Here she is again, female. She's working with the Quartermaster General, reported for active duty in Washington, D.C. And that's not really a very good image. Okay. So you can look these up, and then you get everyone, you get the name of the person and all their service. Or for Opa M. Johnson, it's easy, but if it was a common name, you might want to double check. Okay, when I first had an image up here, I was doing this with a friend, and we took one look at the picture and said, that's World War II, it's got to go. So I just, I'll find a ship. This ship was commissioned in, I think, October 1917, 1918. And out of curiosity, I thought, oh, I wonder, what's the history of this ship? So I go look at a list we have of deck logs. And the last deck log is October 1941. It's the Oklahoma. It's this sort of stuff that makes your research so difficult, because you go up and look at these little tangents. Okay. The Navy can be very difficult to do because, I'm not going to tell my story there, you need to know, the muster rolls are arranged by the vessel or the type of station, and there are more than 300 types of stations. So it can be hard unless you have that information. And the log of the Leviathan, it had a monthly list of officers and numbers of all others. Courts martial, and you keep seeing the same guys getting court-martialed all the time. They don't learn. But on February 15th, 1919, a list of men transferred to Santa Olivia. Humphrey Bogart. So I went to the list of transfers for February 15th and 16th. Bogart's not listed. He's listed in a later date. So again, sometimes it's research. You just got to keep looking until you find what you want to. This, I just want you to see these men are all smiling. They look sort of happy. This is from The Hearts of the World by W.D. Griffith. They're not real soldiers in the trenches. But these, huh?
Yes.
Yes, it is.
Government issue?
I don't know. Is it? I don't. Dang. I don't know. Or by costume department. These are in the records of the Adjutant General of 1917. First are AEF casualty lists, and they give the name, the race, what branch of the Army, if they're an officer, the rank, the organization, and the date of death. And here's Lewis Hawley, West Virginia, and in this list they list them by race, and here he's listed again. This is Henry Gunther, And he died on November 11th, 1918. He was a German family from Baltimore. And he went into the war late, and he wrote back to his friends in Baltimore and said, "You don't want to come over here. This is awful." The censors saw it. So he was reduced in rank from sergeant to private. And he was devastated, just devastated. So at about 10:58, 10:57 on November 11th, he ran toward the German lines. And the Germans said, "Stop, stop." And his American colleagues said, "Stop," and he didn't. But on his record it has killed in action, not suicide. National Guard. These are organized by state, unit, and subject. 26? I don't think we have records for the 26. These were all developed before the National Archives was founded. We were founded in 1935, so we're hoping there may be an anomaly. The subjects vary, but they can include requests for transfer, payment of travel expenses, enlistments. But if you know the unit your person was in, you might want to come to the National Archives and just read the records, see if your person is listed, but also to get a sense of the unit. Courts Martial. I only showed one here for the Courts Martial. This is a man whose family wrote and said his wife had, she was pregnant, she was very upset, could he come home? But here's the response of the commanding captain, and he says, he is also subject to epileptic fits, an affliction which has troubled him for years intermittently, but of late it's been worse. So for his good and the good of the service, I think we should let him go home. And I just think that's a very nice story. Commissioning records. These are for officers, 1917 to 1940, though the information can go on, as we'll see. The forms vary slightly, but it gives you the name, rank, unit, and among other things, the contact person may just be someone they know, not necessarily a member of the family. And discharge information. The government didn't keep copies of discharge papers, but here you can get discharge information. So here's Harry Truman. He's a first lieutenant in the National Guard, August 5th, 1917. He's a captain at Fort Sill. And then he's sent to Camp Funston, Kansas. Why is Camp Funston, now Fort Riley, so important to the history of this period? What happened here? It's where the influenza epidemic started. They've been able to trace it back to, in fact, one person. Okay. Here's, you see, Harry Truman, first lieutenant, Mrs. Martha Truman, Grandview, Missouri. Now this is where the address here is 703 Ridge Arcade, Kansas City. That's not where he lived, but one of my colleagues thinks it's his business address or the address of his attorney or something like that. We have Colonel Potter. This is Colonel Harold E. Potter, a very distant relative of mine. And you can see here he enlisted in, well, it was 1918, 1948. When I first looked at it, I thought, he stayed in the Army 30 years. Who would stay one place for 30 years? And then thought, But he ended as a lieutenant colonel in the European Command in, he was in Paris for a while. And these are only two of the pieces of paper in his file. Veterans benefits. I'm going to go over this quickly because this is very complex, and I promised the staff at the archives I'll do real research on it. Okay, first of all, bonuses is the least I know about. So that's all you're going to hear about bonuses, except the bonus ones. War Risk Insurance Act of October 6, 1917 granted an allotment from the pay of such enlisted support of their families' independence, was temporary, it was not to exceed $50 a month. It would be discontinued at the termination of the war. But what's interesting, you may have heard of the Hello Girls who did the phones on the front. Some of them applied they took out war risk insurance from their pay, but they were not considered U.S. Army until 1971. The unfortunate thing with these records is that, I don't want to get the numbers right on here. Yeah, originally there were 1,701 feet of these records, but they were sampled, and so now we only have 19 boxes. That really, yeah. Pension files. In February of 2016, I wrote to the pension office asking for the file of Louis Holly. And I sent everything I had. And they wrote back and said, you didn't send enough. Talk to the general counsel. Well, or not, write to the general counsel. I didn't argue, I sent it all again. They said, yes, we have a pension for Louis B. Holly. So this is where Louis A. Holly, this is where we referred it to. I'm not sure this is true, but I think I did a really stupid thing, so learn from my mistake. I wrote back and said after a year, where's my file? Somewhere I was told if you submit a Freedom of Information Act request and you follow up, it goes to the end of the pile again. Now, who am I writing to? I'm writing to the VA. Who has got FOIA requests? I expect to hear in about 2 years. So send it off, just be patient, because I don't know what I'm going to get. But I'm not writing again, I'm going to be patient. Non-federal sources. A lot of states commission copies of the records. New York has done it, they're online. When I went to Arlington in Virginia, I went to Berkeley County, they said, I can't release you a DD-214. DD is Department of Defense. Department of Defense is 1950. There are no DD-214s for World War I. I can't show you the circular argument. So go online, because you're from New York. There's the World War I service records. The archives has a brief abstract of New Yorkers' military service records. There's, in fact, I can leave you this overhead. Oh. Roll of honor citizens of the state of New York who died while in the service of the United States. And a lot of the records that are in the website that you have, are some of the Red Hook, Dutchess County Red Hook, are those records. And they were, not everybody completed them. They weren't always done completely, but they can be a very good source of information. This is my favorite friend. He's a French bulldog in a German uniform. And I'm not even sure I'm allowed to use him, but I do. I call him Fred. And he wants to know, do you have any questions? Gun too. Yeah. Do you have any questions?
No.
Yeah. So, my father was in World War II and in the Marine Corps, and he got some medals, and he didn't care about all that stuff and threw them away. After he died, my mother tried to get a record, and nothing came back. My aunt is now bugging me. Why don't you see if your father, had medals? Is there a way to? Two things. Because he was in the Marine Corps. Marine Corps, yeah. And he was an officer, so.
So one, I would go on the National Archives website,
right,
and try to get a SF 180, Standard Form 180, for the Marine Corps. Okay. 2, on the website, it gives you information on how to request copies of medals.
Oh, okay.
And 3, try to see if he received a pension. I mean, I couldn't believe my father's pension somehow got to Seattle, and we got a copy of it. But yeah, I mean, so you're never quite sure where they are. I think this pension's in Suitland, Maryland, but since I don't have the permission of the VA, I can't look at it.
Interesting.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
A neighbor just died. He was a 19-year-old kid from Red Hook who went off to the Korean War. And he came back basically damaged for the rest of his life. Because as I've learned, he wrote a lot of letters home. I haven't seen them yet, but I've promised boxes of them. We'll do a piece on them. But the question I had is what happens to the kids before we knew about PTSD, but which in World War I we called shell shock?
One of the great things of the War Risk Insurance Act, I guess, you didn't want to give men pensions. You gave men pensions in the Civil War. And what did they do? They went back home and did nothing. No. Oh, wait, my tone of voice is telling how I feel about this. The War Risk Insurance Act was, you get those men back up on their feet and you send them right back out. And they really, what's his name? There was some studies on shell shock, and Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen were under this man's care, and the name of the doctor just leaves my mind. And they did do research on it, but people really thought these men were slacking. But you've seen the photographs where they're just shaking.
Yeah.
And it's a very tragic story, and I imagine until fairly recently it was not treated as we would treat it now, and a lot of people try to hide it. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I think so.
And the records, the letters that you have, the National Archives can't accept them, but I would find a good, if the family's willing, a very good repository. If he's from New York, maybe, if he went to a university, the man's university, someplace, ask around to donate those letters, because letters are so valuable and so few are being written these days. So.
Well, we understand that.
Yeah, no, you can do that, yeah.
Well, we talked about it, and his family's willing to do that, which is just terrific, because they are at various ends deep. And yet, they keep turning up. We had occasion, Patsy's grandfather, who was in World War I, and who we kept everything, and Patsy, thank God, keeps everything as well, but she puts it all together in a great story, and we did a piece for our newsletter just a couple of newsletters ago on his service, Roman Brile. And what was fascinating to me was not only is the service picture, which is World War I, and his uniform, and it looks great, but it's him at the front, or near the front. He was in the U.S. Argonne, he was in the Ardennes Forest. And he came back and nobody even knew about it, right, Patsy? I mean,
well, they
you knew
knew
about it.
that he wouldn't talk about
Yeah,
it.
he wouldn't talk about it.
They knew he had been in the service like the other men, but they just didn't talk about it. And I guess it was just too horrific. They didn't want to relive it.
Even my father from World War II, until he was in his mid-80s when he talked about the war. I mean, a lot of you just don't want to. But really, think about donating them here, and as long as there's something that lets people know that the letters are here.
That's part of our goal here. We are working with the VFW on a project called Stories of Service, and we do oral histories. And I did another one just recently, beginning with one with the 92-year-old veteran of World War II. He was too young to see action. He's the last of 6 brothers from Tisley out of a family of 10 to go off and serve in World War II. One of them was his brother, Danny Griffin. Now, I knew Danny, and we all did as kids, because Danny and his business partner owned the Red Hook drugstore. And you always knew Danny from here up. But he's going to him. Oh, hi, Chris. Very pleasant, friendly, quiet. He was stitched in the Battle of the Bulge with 5 machine gun bullets and ended up at Fort Devon Hospital in Massachusetts recuperating, and nobody ever knew that. So these things are incredibly rare.
And also, if you use supporting documentation, please let people know where it's from. Particularly, and I'm digressing here, but in Rev War research, we don't know, is it from the pension file, is it from the papers of the Continental Congress, is it from one of the state archives? So you really want to document where you found it, and it's not always possible, particularly with the earlier records, but when so many of those records, for example, call Lewis Hawley, that information worked over time, so you have that whole preponderance of evidence. Any more questions? Yes, sir.
You mentioned donating the letters. Where would be the best place? I understand there's a university in California that has a project to collect military letters from overseas. I have letters from my grandfather, World War I, and my wife's father, World War II. We've got these letters. They've been transcribed, and now we want to make sure they go to a good area where they'll be studied.
Yeah, when you say World War I, but I think you want to keep this collection together. There's the World War I Museum in Kansas City.
Right.
There's, sometimes it really does require research, but the library, you might check, also the Library of Congress did oral histories. There's a Veterans Project, and you might just Google Veterans Projects. And the other thing you might want to do, I have a collection of papers. It's not military, it's a American who was a journalist in China. And I contacted Missouri, and I said, I never heard back. And people do that, they don't always respond. And so if they don't respond, you can say, yep, I'm offering it one more time, the clock is ticking. So you might want to have several sources and decide where it works best for you. And the other thing you might want to think about, when I first went to donate these papers, I was going to put in some strict access rules. The widow has just died, so I don't need to worry about access. She was rather particular. So is there mention of anyone living? Would you want to restrict access for 50 years after the death? So you want to think about that sometimes in relation to these records. And so many of the men in World War II were in their hundreds. I mean, my father would be 101, my mother would be 101. I would not find problems with that. So you also want to think about that when you donate records. Did I answer your question? I don't know all the repositories for these, but check Library of Congress, check the California group. Again, if somebody went to a particular university, and it doesn't have to be Harvard and Yale, it can be Washington State University in Pullman, Washington. And you'd be amazed at where some of these records. The Kennedy Library, which is part of the National Archives, has the letters, the records of Ernest Hemingway, because that's what Mrs. Kennedy wanted. Any more questions?
Yes, I just have a follow-up question. Are your relatives here in Red Hook?
No, these are Ohio based.
Well, I was going to suggest a great repository.
Yeah, and think of where the person lived when the letters were written. If that makes any sense, yeah. Well, if not, thank you.
Thank you.
So please join us next door. And handouts, that's right, we have handouts. If anybody would like to.
Of the person, one of the things that I'm going to leave for you here is the list of people whose mothers who are eligible to go on the Gold Star pilgrimage, but it's from Dutchess County.
The whole county,
So you get one.
You get one.
And none of them are for Red Hook, but if you want to read newspapers, the people from soldiers here, there's no list of people from Red Hook.
Too fast.
Which door are you talking